Famously, the Militant Tower was called the John Tower. Now, I've actually talked about this before. However, the John Tower used to have an ability that allowed other towers nearby to increase their damage. If that sounds awfully familiar to you, yes, it's actually quite similar to something like the DJ Booth's red track, which allows towers around it to have a buff damage, and is also very similar to the Mercury base, which all towers within range of the Mercury base, up to us when the Mercury base is upgraded to a certain level, gets boosted damage. And I mean, it's also the same for the War Machine. However, the Militant Tower, or the John Tower as it was called back then, was the first tower in the game to be added to have this ability to allow towers within its range to have buff damage. Now, for the Militant, it was obviously an ability, meaning that it only lasted about 10 seconds, whereas for the Mercury base and the DJ booth, it can be permanent if you so wish. But, very interestingly, for the John Tower, it acted very similar to the Commander Tower, where the Commander Tower, it would boost fire rate, whereas the Militant Tower, or the John Tower, would boost damage through abilities. Thereby meaning, back in the day, most people would chain about 3 commanders. Well, actually, in terms of the commander, people chose 3 arbitrarily, I think, because back in the day, the Call to Arms ability lasted 10 seconds and had a 70-second cooldown, but it gave an additional only 10% fire rate buff, whereas the passive commander gave up to a 25% range buff. However, for the John Tower, its buff only lasted 5 seconds back in the day for a 65-second cooldown. However, this was changed into the Mega Update when it was changed to 10 seconds for a 30-second cooldown, similar to how the Commander was changed to a 10-second duration for a 30-second cooldown. So the origins of chaining Commander actually was chaining Commanders and chaining Johns. Bear in mind that the John Tower, its Gorilla Noises ability, it boosted towers damage by 30%, and the Commander buff was actually a 30% boost in fire rate as well. So really, back in the day, what people were doing was they had one person chaining the Commander and one person chaining the John Tower. Unlike the Commander, the John Tower had other utility in the fact that it could actually deal DPS. However, John Tower wasn't the best DPS-based tower. In fact, I think even the Minigunner back in the day was better than the Militant for DPS-wise. However, the fact that it did have an ability which boosted the damage of towers by 30% meant that it was actually a very good tower to bring even for DPS. It's like something like the Shotgunner. When the Shotgunner had the SWAT ban ability, people used to spam that, but they still used the Shotgunner for its good DPS. Now, the ability was called Gorilla Noises. Back in the day, some people said it was called Monkey Noises or something like that. Officially, it's called Gorilla Noises. And the reason why it's called Gorilla Noises is because its upgrade is called Gorilla Sounds, and we just said Gorilla Noises. However, during hardcore testing, when the John Tower was reworked, it was changed to be Enraging Shout, but the ability to boost damage of nearby towers by 30% still existed for the John Tower. It was still called the John Tower back in the day and still here. However, this would be removed in the overhaul update and the John Tower would be renamed to the Militant Tower. Now, for various reasons, many people speculated that the Gorilla Noises, or the Enraging Shout as it was renamed to, would still be in the game, and developers were biding their times because they didn't have time to rebalance the Militant. Reason number 1 is that when the Enraging Shout was not re-added, but it was in the hardcore update, in the 28th of August, the developers actually added new Enraging Shout voice lines for the skins of the John Tower / Militant at the time. So obviously, for the default, you got the you think you're hard, you think you're shut him, yeah. And actually only one of them was called Gorilla Noises, which is probably why it was renamed to Enraging Shout instead of just Gorilla Noises, given the fact that only one of the 4 voice lines were Gorilla Noises. I mean, you could argue that the get him is like gorilla-like noises, but yeah, get him! Not exactly. However, for the 2 skins that existed for the Militant Tower at the time, except for the Hazard Militant / John Tower, it would get voice lines. So the Ace Pilot, which obviously looks like this back in the day, it got voice lines which are in Japanese. So I can't read that, and I don't want to butcher the Japanese language by trying to speak that. So I'm just going to say the English translation, which is, you better be prepared. Which I believe is something from 02. I actually don't know what the anime is called. All I know is there was a 02 trailer once on Tower Defense Simulator, and that was the sound that was used in the trailer. So yeah, it has relevance. Meanwhile, the Pumpkin skin would get a laugh voice line, which sounds like this. And there are 2 voice lines. One of them is faster paced than the other one. So many people thought it was very weird for the developers to change out or to completely remove that ability, given the fact that they were added new voice lines for the ability, only to remove it in the overhaul update, so it only appeared in basically public hardcore testing. Another reason is that if you look at the statistics for level 5, you can see there is a big jump in cost efficiency here, meaning that developers, or some people assumed that the developers, had left ample room for the Militant Tower, or the John Tower, well, the John Tower that was renamed to the Militant Tower in this update, to regain its Guerrilla Noises / renamed Enraging Shout ability. Yeah, hardcore testing, public hardcore testing, wasn't actually the final version of the John Tower / Militant. It's really weird. Like, hardcore testing existed alongside the main game. The main game had like the John ability, which was called Guerrilla Noises, but then in hardcore testing it was renamed into Enraging Shout. So you had technically two abilities at the same time for two different towers. I mean, that's the same tower, but they had two different abilities depending on which version of the game you played, and your stats in hardcore testing didn't even save anyways. More importantly than that though, the Militant Tower, as seen here, says replaces John, work in progress, damage buff temporarily disabled. So from this is a description, by the way, of the public hardcore update, or what would become the overhaul update, before it was released around the 15th of October. Here we can clearly see that the Militant Tower, it would replace the John, but also it would have a damage buff ability, except that it's been temporarily disabled here, probably because the developers didn't have time to actually update the Militant Tower or rework it and balance it. Interesting enough though, the statistics shown off here for the Militant would be the exact same statistics that were shown off in the hardcore update, which was different to the statistics shown off here for the public hardcore testing updates. Yes, there's a lot of testing for the Militant Tower, and here, yeah, we didn't get it. Now, because of this, when the Militant was reworked to have reloading, because yes, reloading did exist. You know, here, 18 ammo, reload time of 2.5 seconds, a glorified burst basically, the Militant Tower would actually still have a noticeable increase in cost efficiency at level 4. I mean, it also did have a noticeable increase at cost efficiency at level 2, but that's because at level 2 only got range and hidden detection. So actually, the level 4 upgrade for the Militant Tower wasn't actually as bad of a cost efficiency as level 2. But as you can see from level 3 to level 4, there was still a massive increase in cost efficiency, which led some people to believe that yes, the developers have still factored in the fact that the Militant Tower was going to get its damage buff ability back. However, as you all know, that wasn't the case. I mean, it was even buffed again. People still thought that the Militant Tower would get its damage buff back, and then ammo was removed. It just lost all reloading. Even here, right, I still thought that some people were asking it to get its damage buff back, given the fact that its cost efficiency is the worst one by far for the Militant Tower. I mean, not really by far, actually. It's only $20 more than this one, level 3. However, the rumours for the Militant getting its damage buff ability back still persisted into 2022, not only because of the leak that was provided on the 15th of October 2020, but also because of an update in the Entity System update. Here, the Militant would actually get reworked so that its ammo was removed. However, a small footnote that developers made into the update log was that they mentioned the damage buff particles would be changed, the damage buff activation particles. Now, very clearly seen here, this is the original particles for the John ability seen here. It's just like it is basically just the Enraging Shout. However, the damage buff particles would be very similar to what the commander sees here, and in fact I believe in this update the commander's buff particles were also updated. So many people thought that the damage buff particles being changed in this update, the Entity System update, alongside a Militant rework, showed that the Militant would soon get its damage buff back. These rumours would also be fueled by the fact that the Gladiator, which it has a fire rate buff ability, which has a similar particle to the original John Enraging Shout. However, the developers in 2022, for some reason, they updated the particles to be that of the damage buff particles seen in the trailer. And as you can see here, these are the correct damage buff indicators, even though the Gladiator does not get a damage buff, it gets a fire rate buff. And I believe this is the only time that the damage buff indicators are actually used in Tower Defense Simulator, and for a tower that doesn't even boost damage. So because of this, many people speculated that the John Tower, well, the Militant Tower, would soon get its damage buff ability back. However, it's been 3 years, has not got it back. In fact, the Militant would receive many rebalancing updates, which would actually reduce the gap between level 3 and level 4 in terms of cost efficiency, and therefore meaning that, really, if you wanted the damage buff ability from the Militant back, it would be quite hard to balance it now, because as you can see here, the cost efficiency for level 4 nowadays is actually better than level 3. Throw in an ability there, and it makes the Militant OP tower. a very OP tower. In fact, probably even better than the Commander Tower, given the fact that the Commander Tower, it can't actually damage other enemies too often, whereas the Militant Tower can. And when the Mercenary Base was added, with its damage buff, passive damage buff, alongside the DJ Boost damage buff, I think this is where all rumours of the Militant regaining its damage buff ability back, even though it was mentioned in the public testing server, it's not going to get it back. All those rumours died when these towers were released, therefore meaning that I don't think many people actually realise nowadays that the Militant Tower was planned to get its damage buff ability back. Now, I don't think people mind too much. I think the game is balanced around the fact that the Militant doesn't have its damage buff ability back, so I'd say it's not really lost too much. I mean, yes, there are some unused content in terms of the voice lines, so interestingly, Ace Pilot voice lines and the Pumpkin Militant voice lines are still in the game. However, they're like sat unused as unused content, and there are no other voice lines for any of the other skins, including the Hazmat Militant skin, which was a skin that back in the day. So when you use the Enraging Shout ability, when you had the Hazmat Militant skin, it would use the default voice lines. However, I would be very interested to see what Enraging Shout voice line for the Lumberjack Militant would sound like. Maybe it will sound like Jay Schlatt. Who knows?